continue a little bit with what we were talking about yesterday, but deal with a chronological issue that sometimes people get a little confused. We know that the Nesi'im brought their Korbanos for 12 days in a row, and as we said yesterday, including Shabbos. So the Korbanos started on Sunday. Sunday through Shabbos is 7 days. And then Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday are the 5 days of the second week, and therefore the Korbanos of the Nesi'im finished on Thursday. So it went from Sunday to the Thursday into the next week. That's how the 12 Nesi'im brought their Korbanos. Now the question is, what were the dates that they brought their Korbanos? So I said yesterday for Davar Pashut that they started bringing Rosh Chodesh Nisan, and it was finished on Yud Beis Nisan. Okay, that's the Pashtus. But I want to go over that a little bit because it's a little confusing in the following way. We know that the Mishkan was essentially erected in two different stages. Initially, there were 7 days of Miluim, which means 7 days of consecration, in which every single day Moshe put up the Mishkan, and Moshe took down the Mishkan every single day for 7 days. And all of the Korbanos for those 7 days, special Korbanos, were brought by Moshe Rabbeinu himself. Moshe was the Kohen for the Shivas Yemei HaMiluim. Then on the 8th day, which is after the Shivas Yemei HaMiluim, that is the first time that Aaron and his sons do the Avodah. And Nadav and Avihu died that day when they tried to bring incense with a foreign fire. Okay, so we know 7 days of Miluim, only Moshe did the Avodah. On the 8th day is dedication of the Mishkan, Chanukas Habayis. Aaron HaKohen does the Avodah, death of Nadav and Avihu. Now here's the problem. The Torah says in Parshas Pikudei that the Mishkan was erected Rosh Chodesh Nisan. That's a given. But the question is, what does the pasuk mean by the Mishkan was erected Rosh Chodesh Nisan? Does that mean Rosh Chodesh Nisan was the first of the 7 Yemei HaMiluim? So erected means temporarily erected, to be taken down. And if that's the case, the way it would work is the Miluim began 23rd of Adar through the end of Adar, and the 8th day, the other way around, I'm sorry. If Hukam HaMishkan means the beginning of the Miluim, that actually means the Miluim were from Rosh Chodesh Nisan to the 7th of Nisan, and the 8th day is not just the 8th day after the 7 Miluim, but the 8th day is the 8th of Nisan. Meaning, according to one type of chronology, the Shiva Shemei HaMiluim began Rosh Chodesh Nisan, and the Yom HaShmini, which is the death of Nadav and Avihu, is the 8th day of Nisan, and that is the day that the Nesi'im began bringing their Korbanos, because everybody is Moda, that whatever the 8th day is when the Nesi'im began. So it turns out, according to that chronology, the Nesi'im brought their Korbanos from the 8th day of Nisan through the 20th day of Nisan. And that's based on the interpretation that the pasuk in Pikudei, that the Mishkan was erected, Rosh Chodesh Nisan, is referring to the first day of the Shivas Yemei HaMiluim. Everyone understands that's one position. The position that Rashi adopts throughout Chumash, which he seems to view as the majority position in Chazal, is very different. That when the Torah says on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, the Mishkan was erected, it is referring to the permanent erection after the Shiva Shemei Miluim, which would mean that the Miluim began the 23rd of Adar through the end of Adar. The Yom HaShmini, the 8th day, is Rosh Chodesh Nisan. Nadav and Avihu died Rosh Chodesh Nisan, and the Nesi'im began their Korbanos on Rosh Chodesh Nisan. So we have actually a machlokes in Chazal. The majority position follows the one that Rashi follows, that the Shiva Shemei Miluim, where Moshe did the Avodah and took down the Mishkan every day, started 23rd of Adar. The permanent erection of the Mishkan is Rosh Chodesh Nisan. Rosh Chodesh Nisan is the death of Nadav and Avihu, and Rosh Chodesh Nisan is also the start of the Nesi'im bringing their Korbanos, and the Nesi'im brought their Korbanos from Rosh Chodesh Nisan through the 12th of Nisan. That is, I mentioned it second, but that is, let's call that, I'll reverse it. That's position number one, which is the Shita that Rashi follows, and seems to be the majority Shita in Chazal. Shita number two says, the Miluim began Rosh Chodesh Nisan. So from Aleph Nisan to the 7th of Nisan, Moshe Rabbeinu did the Avodah and put up the Mishkan and took it down. The 8th day, which is the permanent erection of the Mishkan, is the 8th day of Nisan as well. That is the day of the deaths of Nadav and Avihu. That is the first day of the Chanukas HaNesi'im. And the Chanukas HaNesi'im was Nimshach from the 8th of Nisan through the 20th of Nisan. Two different shitas. All of this depends on how you interpret the pasuk in Pekudei that Rosh Chodesh Nisan Hukam HaMishkan. Does Hukam HaMishkan mean the temporary erection of the first day of the Shiva Shemei Miluim? Or does it mean the permanent erection, which would make Rosh Chodesh Nisan the 8th day, and the actual inauguration of Aaron, the death of Nadav and Avihu, and the Chanukas and Nesi'im. Now this is a big machlokas, and as I say, Rashi throughout Chumash, and this is probably the mainstream position that you've heard, is that the dedication of the Mishkan was official on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, and that is the day that Nadav and Avihu died, and that is the day of Chanukas and Nesi'im. I just want to share with you, though, a very, very interesting ha'ara of the Even Ezra, in which he actually defends and he tries to prove the validity of the other chronology, at least according to Chazal. In Parshas Balaischa, we read, this is already 2 weeks later, the 14th of Nisan, they bring a Korban Pesach. Right, this is after the dedication of the Mishkan, whether the Mishkan was dedicated the 8th of Nisan or the 1st of Nisan, whatever it is, but the 14th of Nisan is the Korban Pesach. This is the second Korban Pesach that the Jews are bringing, because the very first one was in Mitzrayim itself, and this is 1 year after they left Mitzrayim, and this is the Korban Pesach. By the way, Rashi points out a very interesting point that might elude us. This is the only Korban Pesach they brought in the Midbar. The next Korban Pesach is not going to be brought until Yehoshua ben Nun, when they crossed the Yarden. There was no Korban Pesach for the 40 years that they wandered in the desert, except for the first year after they left Mitzrayim. Now, why that is so is an interesting shaila. Some understand that it's a Gzeras HaKosav, that really the Korban Pesach is connected to Eretz Yisrael. It was a special dispensation to bring it once in the Midbar, but Pesach is Toloi on Eretz Yisrael. That's one pshat. There's another pshat that they should have brought a Korban Pesach, but they were not able to. And the reason they were not able to is for the following reason. The Torah says in Parshas Bo that if a person is an Orel, if a person is uncircumcised, they cannot bring a Korban Pesach. According to many Rishonim, that's even if they medically are not allowed to be circumcised because of sakana, their hemophilia, they still cannot bring a Korban Pesach. But there's an unusual halacha that not only is an Orel disabled from bringing a Korban Pesach, but if you have a son or an Eved that is uncircumcised, you cannot bring a Korban Pesach. So Now, granted, the Gemara's maskana is if the son is not yet 8 days old, it's not ma'akev you because there's no milah yet. Otherwise, everybody with a son under 8 days old could not bring a korban pesach. That's called areila shelo bismana, meaning if someone's an RL and it's not yet the zman of bris milah, that's not ma'akev. But if somebody has a son that's older than that, even if medically there wouldn't be a bris for a medical reason, it's ma'akev. Now, it's brought down, and you see this in Yoshua, in Sefer Yoshua, that although all of the Yidden who left Mitzrayim had a bris, they did a bris before they brought the Korban Pesach, in the Midbar, they did not practice the mitzvah of bris milah after the Chet HaMeraglim. And the reason is, because after the Chet HaMeraglim, we had less divine protection, and under the conditions in the desert, it would have been a sakana to circumcise babies. So it turns out the first Pesach after we left Mitzrayim, that's still before the Chet HaMeraglim. So all of the kids were circumcised. But by the time you get to any Pesach after that, you've already had newly born children who were not circumcised in the Midbar. And Mimela, nobody could bring a Korban Pesach until Yoshua ben Nun, where the book of Yoshua records that everybody circumcised, because the Milah's Ma'akiv. So this might be one explanation why they didn't bring a Korban Pesach for the Midbar. It's very, very schwer, because nobody could bring a Korban Pesach? I mean, it's my son that's Ma'akiv. So every single person had a son that didn't have a bris. I mean, there are certainly people who may go through without having sons. Slavchad, for example. Slavchad didn't have any sons, right? So why didn't Slavchad bring a Korban Pesach? Meaning, how could you say that because of Milas Banav Ma'akeves, you couldn't bring a Korban Pesach? The Torah itself tells us at least one guy, probably more, didn't have any sons. So L'maisa, that reason is a little schwer. But the Mefarshim say there's another reason that Al Pi Halacha, the Korban Pesach, is totally on Eretz Yisrael. But the one Pesach they did bring, that's the one in Parshas Baloscha, was a special Gezeres HaKasav. Yeah.
Isn't it brought down in Kedushin that like the mitzvot of Tzviot Ba'aretz, the only things that are connected to the land itself?
It really says it the opposite way. It says any mitzvah tluya b'aretz is only noeg in Eretz Yisrael. Right. But there may be mitzvos that are not tluya b'aretz that might only be noeg in Eretz Yisrael. And that was but be it as it may, you see, I mean the truth is all korbanos really are totally on the Beis Hamikdash, and they are connected to Eretz Yisrael. But if Hashem allowed us to bring it in the Midbar, it's a special Gezeres HaKasav. Yeah.
Just sidetracking on that, Neteravai is also to look like in Chutz La'aretz, is it not?
Yes, those are halacha l'moshe misinas. There are a number of exceptions. I mean, Orla is nayeg in Chutz La'aretz. Neteravai might be nayeg in Chutz La'aretz. Chodesh, which is a biggie, maybe we'll give a share on that. Chodesh, the yisur that you're not allowed to eat grain until the bringing of the Omer or the date of the Omer. Many poskim, big machlokas, many poskim say Chodesh is noeg in Chutz La'aretz. Challah, now that's the Rabbanan, separating challah from dough is noeg in Chutz La'aretz. So some of these exceptions are dairaisas, like Orla, and some like challah are midrabanan, but the truth is that there are quite a few exceptions to these rules. So be it as it may, it's notable that this is the only Korban Pesach that they bring in the Midbar. Yeah.
What you said about the idea that they didn't do Brit Milah in the Midbar.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is that something that comes from the Sorah, or is that just an explanation?
No, this is in the Gemara. First of all, this is in the Gemara, but I should say I'll give you a better proof. If you look at Sefer Yoshua, Perek Beis, where Yehoshua has a mass circumcision ceremony, the Navi says all of the nation that left Mitzrayim were circumcised, but the children born in the desert were not. It doesn't give you a reason, but it actually, look in Perek Beis of Yoshua and you'll actually see the reason. The idea of being unprotected, sakana, that's given in the Gemara, explaining the pasuk in Sefer Yoshua. and the like. Okay, so be it as it may, this is a very special event, the only Korban Pesach in the Midbar. And then you know the story that people who were Tameh, they went to Moshe Rabbeinu and they said, why a person who's Tameh cannot bring a Korban Pesach? And these people said, why should we be deprived of being able to serve Hashem? And Moshe asked Hashem, and Hashem said, if somebody is Tameh or far away, we'll talk about that in a moment, they can bring the Korban Pesach 1 month later, and that is the origin of the special day that's called Pesach Sheni, 14th of Ohr. Now here, though, the Ibn Ezra is going on maybe a peripheral point, but you'll see how relevant it is to the chronology. Who were these people who were Tameh? And why were they Tameh? So the Gemara in Sukkah, some of you might have learned this, the Gemara in Sukkah has a machlokas, who were the Tameim. According to one view, the people that were Tameh were the Leviim whose job it, or some of the Leviim whose job it was to carry the bones of Yosef. Apparently this was a rotating job among the Leviim, and these Leviim, they happened to be on call for that week of Pesach, whatever it is. So they were Tameh because they happened to be carrying the bones of Yosef. And again, just to remind you of the laws of Tumah, that you can become Tameh in 3 different ways. Touching a dead body, moving a dead body, or being under the same roof with a dead body. These are 3 different ways of Tumah. Maga, touching the actual body, which that didn't happen here. Yosef is in a coffin. Masa, carrying, which also means moving the body. And ohel, being under the same roof. So if they were carrying the coffin of Yosef, they would become Tameh by Tumas Masa, just technically what the Tumah would be. So they were Tameh. They couldn't bring the Korban Pesach. But there's another Shita in the Gemara, that the people who were Tameh, and it actually gives you the names of them, they were Mishael and Elsafon, who were Leviim. And why were they Tameh? Because they carried out, when Nadav and Avihu died, because they were bringing a foreign fire, a fire from outside to burn incense, and they died, Mishael and Elsafon were given the task of taking their bodies out of the Mishkan. So they actually became Tameh in 2 different ways, actually 3 ways, actually. They became Tameh B'Ohel, they're under the cover, the roof of the Mishkan. They became Tameh B'Maga, they're touching the body. They became Tameh B'Maga. It makes no difference, but technically they became Tameh in all 3 ways. And they were Tameh. Now, here's what the Ibn Ezra says. If you're going to go with the standard rabbinic chronology, that Nadav and Avihu died on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, well, how long are you Tameh? When I come in contact with a dead body, in whatever way, Maga, Masa, Ohel, how many days am I Tameh? I'm Tameh for 7 days. What I have to have is, there's a procedure. On day 3, I need to be sprinkled with the ashes of the Para Aduma. And on day 7, I need to be sprinkled with the ashes of the Para Aduma, day 3 and day 7. And then on day 7, I go to the mikveh. And that night, I'm tahor. There's no korban for a tamei meis, unlike other tumas. Right? So, if you say that Mishal and Elsafon became Tameh Rosh Chodesh Nisan, why would they be Tameh Erev Pesach, which is the 14th of Nisan? They could have had Haza'ah, the sprinkling, on day 3 and day 7. They could have gone to the Mecca. They would have been Tar. What's the problem? Why would Mishal and Elsafon have a problem, Erev Pesach, bringing a Korban Pesach? But, says the Ibn Ezra, now even this is not going to be so clear, but, says the Ibn Ezra, if we go with the alternative chronology, we can understand Mishael and Elsafain's problem. Because according to the other chronology, Nadav and Avihu died on the 8th of Nisan, not on Rosh Chodesh Nisan. Now, it's still not going to be so clear, but let's see the Shaila. So, if they became Tamei on the 8th of Nisan, and they're Tamei for 7 days, so 8 is day 1, right? So 8th of Nisan, 9th of Nisan, 10th of Nisan, 11th of Nisan, 12th of Nisan, 13th of Nisan, 14th of Nisan. So the 14th of Nisan would be day 7 of their Tumah. So this itself poses a very interesting question. A Tamei person cannot bring a Korban Pesach, right? That's a given. What if Erev Pesach is the 7th day of your Tumah, meaning to say by the time it's time to eat the Korban Pesach, you'll be able to eat it because you'll be Tahor. In other words, what's the problem? The simple understanding is, why can't a Tamei bring a Korban Pesach? Because a person who's Tamei cannot eat Korbanos. So Memela, if I'm Tamei, I can't bring a Korban Pesach because I won't be able to eat it. But wait a second. That's not a problem if Erev Pesach is day 7, because if Erev Pesach is day 7, I mean, after all, I'm not touching the Korban. I mean, we have a Kohen that does the Avodah. So what's wrong with me as a Tamei person bringing a Korban Pesach on the 7th day of my Tumah, 7th day, because I'll be able to eat at night? So this is actually a machlokas in the Gemara, but the Eben Ezra points out that lahalacha we actually paskin that even if you're going to be tahor by the time of achila, if you're tamei at the time of shechita, you're not allowed to bring the Korban Pesach. So the Eben Ezra says, if you go with the chronology that Nadav and Avihu died on the 8th of Nisan, then Erev Pesach is day 7, and then we can have a halacha that they could not bring a Korban Pesach. But if you go with the chronology that Rashi adopts, that Nadav and Avihu died Rosh Chodesh Nisan, why would they be Tamei at all? Right. So this is an interesting raya that the Eben Ezra brings to the alternative chronology. But the truth is, it's not a raya, because after all, there is a machlokas in the Gemara. Are the people Tamei because of Arono Shel Yosef, or are they Tamei because of Nadav and Avihu? So it could be that Rashi learns maybe that's the machlokas. If you say Nadav and Avihu, you're going with the 8th of Nisan chronology. But if you say Arono Shel Yosef, then even Rosh Chodesh Nisan, the Mishkan was dedicated, but they were Tamei all through because they were carrying Yosef's bones, so they wouldn't have been in a position to become Tor. Okay, but this is again an interesting raya that the Eben Ezra brings. Yeah.
Is there any problem with eating like a Tamei Korban Pesach? Like the meat itself is Tamei. They're on the 7th. They brought it on their 7th day, and seemingly they touched the food.
Well, here's the question. I mean, first of all, an animal that's alive does not become Tamei. So if I'm handling a sheep and I'm Tamei, right, Elamai, after it's shechted, it can become Tamei, but it could be they didn't have to touch it, meaning to say other people could prepare it, right, and they will be in a position to eat it once there's nightfall, right? So it's not so pashut that if I'm going to be tar at night, I can't bring a Korban Pesach. It's actually a machlokas in the Gemara, but we actually paskin that a Tamei person, b'shas shechita, cannot bring the Korban Pesach. Okay. Yeah.
Is there a possibility that whether or not we can accept Ibn Ezra's raya is dependent on the Gemara's reasoning for possibly more strictly?
Say again?
Is there a possibility that whether or not Ibn Ezra's raya that he'd still be Tamei, and depending on the Gemara, that it really whether or not that makes sense is dependent on why the Gemara possibly is more strict?
That may be so. In other words, if you want to tell me that the Gemara paskins strictly precisely because of the reconstruction of the chronology, then that would indicate that the Eben Ezra is right. But I don't think, if I recall, I'll check again, I don't think the Gemara directly uses that as a proof. So the Eben Ezra cannot use that as a proof if the Gemara itself doesn't use it as a proof. But I think you are correct. If the Gemara would use it as a proof to a halacha, that would be a very, very strong proof that the assumption is that is the correct chronological sequence. Okay. So now let's go back to this chronology. So all of this is relevant as to when the Chanukas and Nesi'im took place. Okay. So again, as they say, people are sometimes a little confused about the chronological sequence. So I wanted you to be aware of it. One final ha'ara about the Chanukas and Nesi'im. We spoke about it yesterday. And the fact that it's Doches Shabbos, which is a big chiddush, because technically the Korban of the Nesi'im is a Korban Yachid, and a Korban Yachid normally does not override Shabbos, but this was a Gezeiras HaKosov. But the other notable feature about the Korban HaNesi'im that everybody points out is for 12 days in a row, they brought the same things over, each Nasi brought the same things over and over and over and over again. That's interesting because although Parshas Naso is the largest parsha in the Torah, it is not the hardest to learn because so many of the psukim are repetitious, both in terms of words and in terms of trup. Although I still remember, it's just when I was in 7th grade, so it was Hanukkah, so you have to read the Nesi'im. So my job was to read on the 8th day of Hanukkah. So I figured, Nesi'im, no problem at all. Everyone Nesi'im, I know it by heart. Problem is, on the 8th day of Hanukkah, you kind of go beyond the Nesi'im into I still remember my abject terror in Shalishi, knowing a Revi, I didn't, I had no idea whatever, okay. I survived, Baruch Hashem, but okay. So it's always a good point. If you ever have to lane, be sure that you check exactly what the laning is. Although I'll tell you a nice story in the other way around. This is a story about Rosh Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. It's a beautiful story. That there was a boy whose bar mitzvah was a certain Shabbos, and he was not that bright. So for him to prepare a haftorah was a big task, and he prepared like for a year, etc., etc. But they didn't check the calendar that somehow that Shabbos was like Erev Rosh Chodesh, which is a different haftorah. He had prepared the haftorah for the Parshas Hashavua. And somehow they missed out that that's not the haftarah for that week. And the boy could not, obviously he could not read a haftarah, just without preparing. So Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach just told the Gabbai, he says, we're going to skip the Rosh Chodesh haftarah. We're going to read the haftarah of the week because to embarrass this boy is a much bigger avera than reading the wrong haftarah. So he actually paskened halacha l'maisa to read the incorrect haftarah, not to be mavayish the child. Yes, it's actually a very beautiful story in that way. And it was not like a public announcement. He told the Gabbai privately that this is. Here, there's another part of the story too. Listen to this. This was not his show. He was asked the shayla like Friday. It was not even his show. They called him up. On Shabbos, he showed up for that haftarah. And he had to walk 2 miles. They asked him, why did you show up? Because I know if I would have said to read the wrong haftarah and I wouldn't be there, then when they start reading the wrong haftarah, people are going to yell or people are going to make a fuss. So I wanted to come to be sure that people know this is being done with my approval. So he actually walked 2 miles to be in shul when the boy read the wrong haftarah, not to be mavayish. So that's something to think about when you think about what makes a gadol. This is also part of what makes a gadol, a very important part of what makes a gadol. But be it as it may, we have the Nesi'im, it's all the same trup, all the same words. So the question becomes the obvious question that many people ask, and that is, what is the point of the Torah repeating the same thing over and over again? The Torah could have said, Nachshon ben Aminadav of the tribe of Yehuda brought all of these korbanos, and then it could have said, and every Nasi did the same thing. Why do you have to repeat it over and over and over again? So there are really 2 terutzim that the Meforshim give, and both terutzim teach us important lessons. Terutz number 1 is that the Medrash Rabbah in Parshas Naso goes over the symbolic value of each of these items, meaning what did the Kaf Sahav represent, what did the Ketoras represent, and it shows you that every Shevet had a unique kavana in what they were doing. Meaning the golden spoon that Yehuda brought was not for the same reason as the golden spoon of Yisachar. Which means, although in chitzonius, although externally, they did the same thing, spiritually, each korban was different. Each korban had different kavanos. Each korban brought different spiritual powers into the world. And therefore the Torah repeats it 12 times because it was not the same. It was 12 different korbanos. And this is an important musar for us. On one hand, bechitzonius, externally, all of us do the same mitzvahs. We daven, we put on tefillin, we keep Shabbos, we keep kosher. But we also have to bring our own individual personalities to the mitzvahs that we do. Each of us has a different way of looking at things, a different way of thinking, a different way we want to connect to Hashem. And we have to somehow foster within our personalities the uniqueness of our connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. This is a very hard thing because, obviously, it's an obvious point that to be a religious Jew takes a lot of conformity. I mean, there's a lot of things we do the same. Right? We don't totally march to the beat of our own drum, so to speak. I mean, otherwise you don't have a religion. Everyone does their own spiritual thing. We have mitzvahs, we have halacha, we have a common framework. At the same time, you have to foster an individuality within that framework. So even if bechitzonius we do the same thing, each of us does it in a different way. And that is what the Nesi'im are teaching us, to find this multiplicity, this diversity within the community and within the achdus of a common mission. Right, so that's point number one. Point number two is this. The Nesi'im all brought the same thing. So the real hero of the Nesi'im story is the man of day 2. And that is Nesanel ben Suar of the tribe of Yisachar. Here we have on day 1, Nachshon ben Aminadav brings a magnificent gift. On his own, he decided, I'm going to bring this beautiful, beautiful gift for the Mishkan. Day 2, Nesanel ben Suar has to make a decision. Is this going to be a competition where I kind of do something better? Or do I kind of say, we're all on the same page, and our job is to work together rather than simply show off? In other words, Nesanel ben Suar determined the whole pattern of everything. It's very similar to Lahavdil, George Washington. George Washington was the first president of the United States. And he set a lot of patterns, a lot of minhagim of the American presidency were really because of Washington. For example, people wanted to refer to him as Your Excellency because that was the title they were used to using. And he did not allow that because he said, we're not a monarchy. The whole idea of a president only serving 2 terms and then retiring until FDR, this was not a law. The Constitution does not limit a president, at least originally, does not limit a president to 2 terms. But Washington made it a minhag. Washington was kovea a minhag that it shouldn't be like a lifetime job. And indeed, it was followed legamri as a minhag, right? Minhag in the United States, until Franklin Roosevelt, who ran for 4 terms. He died at the beginning of his 4th term. And then the Republicans got through a constitutional amendment that nobody could, now it's in the Constitution, and an amendment to the Constitution, that nobody could be president for more than 2 terms. But until then, it was a minhag, right? And George Washington was kovea the minhag. So what we have is Nesanel ben Suar was kovea the idea that this is not about competition. We're all on the same page. And therefore the Torah repeats it 12 times to show that the Nesi'im were not into competition. They were not into one-upmanship. They understood that this is about avodas Hashem. This is not about ego gratification or competition. So they tell a beautiful story about the Panovich Harav. And the Panovich Harav died in 1968 I remember I was in the 9th grade when the Panovich Harav died. I had not heard of him before, but I was just in high school, and I remember that both the high school and the yeshiva in Eretz Yisrael were all called together. The Rosh Yeshiva, Rav Ruderman Zatzal, was a very good friend of the Panovich Harav. He was going to give a hesped, and I still remember this because I have never seen this before or after or since. The Rosh Yeshiva was speaking in Yiddish. I had no idea what was going on. I was falling asleep. 9th grade, I was a 9th grade kid. And all of a sudden, I wake up with a start because the Rosh Yeshiva started crying, and he said everybody should sit on the ground. We should get off the chairs and sit on the ground to mourn this gadol. To this day, I have not seen that in any levaya where the whole tzibor is told to sit on the ground. But that I remember at the Panovich Harav, the hesped in Eretz Yisrael. And the Panovich Harav, there were 800 rabbanim in Lithuania, 800 community rabbanim. 799 died in the Holocaust. Panovich Harav was the only survivor. And because of this, he was a gadol b'Torah, to be sure, but he was also obsessed with rebuilding Torah. Why did Hashem spare him? So he not only built the Panovich Yeshiva, but he built many yeshivas. He built hospitals, he built orphanages, he built Beis Yaakovs, he built, communities, whole towns. He was an amazing fundraiser. In fact, the Satmar Rebbe, when Neil Armstrong went to the moon the first time, so people were discussing, can there be life on other planets? Now they reopened it a little bit with Mars. So Satmar Rebbe says, I'm not a scientist, I don't know about science, but I have 100% raya. There is no life on other planets. If there would be life on other planets, the Panovich Harav would be collecting money there. And if the Panovich Harav has not gone to Mars, I know there's nothing there. This is what Satmar Rebbe said. So the Panovich Harav was really the total package, so to speak, because he was a gadol b'Torah, but he could relate to everybody, religious, non-religious. He had jokes, he had stories, he had musar. So people gave because he was such an engaging personality. And so the story goes that he once came to Chicago. And in those days, you didn't even have jet flights. So to go from Eretz Yisrael, probably wasn't even a direct flight, to New York would be 20 hours, and then another few hours to Chicago. And he shows up to collect money. He normally did very well in Chicago. And a meshulach from a much smaller yeshiva, a Novardika yeshiva, shows up the same time. When he sees the Panovich Harav, he turns white because he realizes, no way I'm going to compete with him. I mean, he's like superstar. So the meshulach basically said to himself, okay, tonight I'm not going to collect any money. I'll sit in the audience. I'll hear a beautiful shir. I'll hear a shmooze. I'll hear maisim. I'm here just to learn from the Panovich Harav. I'm not here to collect any money. All right. So once he got over that, so he was happy. He was sitting and listening. So the Panovich Harav gave his usual drasha with musar and ashkafa and Torah learning and jokes and stories. And he enthralls the crowd. And they're going to give him a lot of money because he is, first of all, it's his own personality, and second of all, it's the many causes that he's collecting for. At the end of his speech, the Panovich Harav says, Rabosai, I have a favor to ask you. There's a very chashuv yid from Bnei Brak who's here tonight, who has a wonderful, wonderful yeshiva, and I'm asking you that whatever you are going to give me, please give him. Please give him. Well, suffice it to say, the Novardika Meshulach did much better than he had ever done before. He got a lot of money. He was very successful. He went over to the Panovich Rebbe afterwards and he said, Rebbe, I'm so grateful for what you did, but I really don't understand. You took a 20-hour trip from Eretz Yisrael to go to Chicago. You're not a young man, and you're simply giving up all of this money to another cause, another yeshiva. So the Panovich Harav said, I don't know what you mean, another yeshiva. Are we in competition? Are we in rivalry? We work for the same boss. We serve the same cause. If I make enough money that 20 Avreichim, let's say, could learn in Kollel for a week, I don't care if they're learning under the roof that Panovich Beis Medrash, or they're learning under the Novardik Beis Medrash. 20 people are learning Torah. Who cares what building they're sitting in? Now, this is quite an amazing story because even great Rosh Yeshivas, they have their yeshiva, and yet the Panovich Rav was so above the idea of competition that he saw. Now, granted, there may be a Makom Torah that he would not regard as authentic, whatever it is, that's a separate issue. But if it was an authentic Makom Torah, the Panovich Rav didn't care if it was his yeshiva or some other yeshiva. I collect money so 20 people can learn. Let it be here. Let it be here. There's no competition here. We're on the same page. We work for the same boss. We're on the same team. Remarkable. The only other person I can think was really, really like that was actually a more recent person. That was Rav Nosson Tzvi Finkel, the Rosh Yeshiva of Mir, who died relatively young, tragically, and was ill for many, many years. But when he used to collect money, and he saw Avreichim in Lakewood or Baltimore, he would give the money to them if he felt they needed it. Ad kedei kach, that I'm told, maybe I hope this is accurate. I think it is, that Mir made a takana that he was not allowed to kind of hold money, meaning they always had a person following him. That when the money was given, it would be in that person's rishus, because the Rosh Yeshiva was so above the notion of institutions that he didn't care. Mir, Lakewood, Israel, whatever it would be, it's all the same. Well, the Mir office didn't quite look at it that way, so they had to have somebody that was custodian of the funds. But going back to the Nesi'im, this I think is the lesson of the Nesi'im as well, that we're not in competition. We're here to glorify HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and we will do it. We will do it together. Okay, have a good day.